Today I wanted to talk about, I will talk about integrity. And I begin with a story in a book by Dosho Port, who's a Zen priest. He tells the story of his training, where he was at a monastery doing long-term, month-by-month training. And they would get up at 4:30 in the morning to begin their day. And the first thing that happened at that 4:30 wake-up was they'd gather, and each of the monk trainees in turn, day by day, would have to give what's called a Dharma talk. They would talk about something related to the teachings of the Buddha. So one of his fellow monks tells this story. While I was walking to the Zendo, and that's where they met, I began crossing the street just as a piece of newspaper was picked up by the wind and blown across my path. As I bent down to pick up the paper, I thought, I hope someone sees me bending down to pick up this paper. So I froze. I didn't want to pick up the newspaper for the wrong reason. I could see how stinky my ego was, only wanting to do something small for the good if someone saw me doing it. Then I noticed no one else was around, so I started chasing the paper. But just as I bent down to grab it, I thought, I still will know that I'm doing something good. So picking it up is still stinky. I didn't know what to do. By this time, the newspaper had blown away, so I gave up. Out of the silence, Roshi, their leader, growled, "Pick up the newspaper!" Integrity, according to the dictionary, is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles or moral uprightness. Two main aspects, being honest and having strong moral principles or being morally upright. And frankly put, I think integrity is sadly lacking today. Maybe this has always been the case, but I haven't lived in all those other past eras. But today, you can look around, and with the advent of modern media, you can see the lack of integrity in so many aspects of life. Politics is an obvious one, but also how about businesses that deliberately use inferior parts, pay their employees unfair wages, secretly pollute because it's cheaper? How about those who produce life-saving drugs and escalate the price purely for profit? There's a million ways that we can see integrity not being practiced around us. I think of Afghanistan, a country that I lived in for a year where nothing could be accomplished by an Afghan dealing with another Afghan unless a bribe was paid. That the police, if called, would literally ask for payment before they would investigate the crime. And yet it called itself an Islamic Republic, paying lip service to its moral standards of Islam, yet living the reality of endless corruption. But this is not limited to religious countries. If you look at the old Soviet Union or China, officially atheist, corruption was rampant there too. Integrity was sadly lacking. What we desperately need in all walks of life are people who are both honest and morally upright. But as with all things, once we start using words to describe concepts like good or bad or honest or morally upright, things can get a little muddled. So we're going to look deeper at what these things mean. I'm going to use a couple of religious perspectives that I'm familiar with. As I said in a previous sermon, I think it's important that when each one of us speak, we speak from depth rather than shallowness. It's far more important, I think, for you to get teachings that I've spent some time studying than if I try to study a different perspective I know nothing about and can only give you what I managed to glean in, say, a week of study. So other people, other traditions, other philosophies will have other profound teachings on these. I'll just give you a couple. And again, I don't use these because of a particular authority coming from the two men I'll be talking about, but because the words themselves resonate with me and maybe with you. I think they're well put. I think they make sense. And as a transcendentalist said, The truth is the truth no matter who says it. Jesus' words would be just as profound if spoken by a pagan. And if you believe that, then perhaps you will find truth in the things I share, whether or not you consider the two people to be authorities that I'll be quoting. The first is Zen Master Dogen, the founder of the Japanese Soto Zen Buddhism that I've been practicing. His collected works, his magnum opus, if you will, is called Shobogenzo, and it's divided into what are called fascicles, which are like books of the Bible. So his 10th fascicle is called Shoaku Makusa, not doing wrong. And something so simple as not doing wrong is expounded upon in incredible depth, and frankly, some of it's perplexing. A lot of his writing is perplexing. A lot of Zen is perplexing. You think about it for a long time. But I'm going to give you some of the more basic concepts and see if this might help you as we wrestle with this concept of integrity. He writes, even if wrong upon wrong pervades the whole universe, and even if wrongs have swallowed the whole Dharma again and again, there is still salvation and liberation in not committing wrong. Brad Warner, a Zen priest who wrote a paraphrase of his entire work, says it this way in a modern vernacular. Even if the whole universe is nothing but a bunch of jerks doing all kinds of jerk-type things, there is still liberation in simply not being a jerk. Now, think about that. If wrong upon wrong prevails throughout the whole universe, if you are surrounded completely by people doing wrong, he argues there is still salvation and liberation in not committing wrong, in being the one who's different. And we'll come back to some more thoughts on this not doing wrong, not committing wrong. Jesus talked about integrity in Matthew chapter 7, amongst other places, when he says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. And you could substitute for false prophet, politician, business leader, any religious leader. Beware of them. If on the outside they look like sheep, but inside they're ravenous wolves. They want to devour you. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. And if you're not sure what all this fruit talk is about, it's the works. What do these people do? Not what they say, not what they look like, not what they pretend to be. What do they produce? As a tree produces fruit, people produce deeds, actions. And by those, you will be able to tell what they really are in their depth. In this same chapter, Jesus tells us how to relate to others. Judge not, that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. With what measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank that's in your own eye?
Right.
How can you say to your brother, let me remove that speck from your eye? And look, there's a plank in your own. Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. How far this is from some forms of Christianity we see practiced today. It's also pretty far from how both the political left and the political right act. Judgment comes fast and furious, especially on the news media. 24-hour news is all about passing judgment before you have all the facts. While it's true that outrageous lies have become all too common in political discourse, it's also true that the media have been caught in lies, and not just recently. And of course, this is a huge thing now because we have this false fake news narrative going on. If anyone needs to be careful now, it's the news media, that they get all their facts right before they do a story. But back in 2004, Dan Rather ran a 60-minute story attacking George W. Bush's time in the National Guard. And some documents that they used were never properly authenticated, and it caused quite a scandal and ultimately led to Rather's career with CBS ending. Some argue that they wanted him out anyway because he'd been around a long time and they wanted new blood. But in either case, this story was a debacle for Dan Rather. If only they had practiced a little more integrity and not run a story when there was still some doubt. CNN was under attack very recently for running a story and then retracting it, and resulted in the resignation of 3 of their journalists. And quoting from the New York Times, they say the article written by veteran reporter Thomas Frank linked Anthony Scaramucci, a hedge fund manager and Trump confidant, to a Russian investment fund supposedly being investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee. The reporting was attributed to an anonymous source. And so it turned out the story was false, 3 people resigned, and now CNN is constantly accused by the president of being a fake news organization. It doesn't help that they did run a story that was false, but to their defense, they retracted it, the people resigned. You don't see that coming from the president. I'm not sure what drives the media to make these decisions. Probably money, probably trying to beat out the competition. Perhaps right now there are media personalities who feel it is their absolute #1 goal, and indeed their purpose in life, to take down President Trump for the good of the country. They view this almost as a war for the soul of the country. And when you're at war, anything goes.
Yeah.
And integrity gets flushed down the toilet. And you have to maintain the integrity. Even if you think you're fighting evil, you still have to have integrity when you do it. Or you get undermined. You undermine yourself when you don't. Let's look at the definition of integrity again. The quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, or being morally upright. So let's take honesty first. Whenever you start saying that it's important to always tell the truth, there's immediately going to be someone, or many someones, who say, well, wait a second, what about this instance? Jancy knows, she does it to me all the time. There are going to be circumstances where being honest might cause more harm than not saying anything. Or perhaps vacillating. We used to get this example in the Air Force. When I was at officer training school, which is our basic training for people who are going to be officers, we were told all about integrity and how you had to be honest all the time. But there was an exception. And the classic example they gave us was, well, let's suppose the commander invites all the officers and enlisted over for a cookout or a dinner. And that commander's wife comes up and says, well, how did you like the meal? And you hated the meal. You hated the meal. Are you really going to say, I hated the meal? No. And there's no one in the Air Force that expects you to say, I hated the meal. Okay? You're allowed to word that differently. You're allowed to lie. You can say it was great because you're not trying to cause harm. You're not trying to gain benefit. You're being polite to someone who made you a meal. Okay? So I get all that. But that's not what we're talking about with integrity. Because most of the time, if you think about it, if you're trying to tell a half-truth, trying to twist the information somehow and not be honest, usually it's because it's more convenient for us, or we've gotten ourselves in a little bit of a fix and we're trying to get out of it, and lying's the easier way to deal with it. That's when the integrity side comes into play. Not when you're trying not to hurt someone's feelings who did something nice for you. So, when you are faced with these choices, these difficult choices, and we all are, what do you do? What do you do? Do you become paralyzed like the monk? Or do you pick up the newspaper? You know that's the right thing to do, just pick it up. Don't let your thoughts muddle the issue. If there are times when telling the truth is more harmful than a more creative approach, you will have to make that determination. I'm not going to sit up here and give you a bunch of laws that you must obey or not obey. You're given the principles. No one else should be sitting there holding your hand saying, here's what you have to do in this situation. That's the hard work of being human. That's the hard work of being alive. That you're going to face these difficult situations and have to make difficult determinations. But if you have been practicing integrity in your life on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis, you will probably have a far less difficult time of dealing with these tough situations when they come up. Don't expect others to give you the answers. The absolute, always this, always that sort of commandments that some religions do, because life's simply not that black and white. So let's go back to that poor monk who wouldn't pick up the newspaper. Why the struggle? Perhaps he was thinking about Dogen's discussion of right and wrong. From the same fascicle in Shobogenzo, we read, even though we caution against the intentional commitment of wrongs, and even though we encourage the deliberate practice of rights, this should be in the reality of not committing wrong. Now that sentence probably didn't make a whole lot of sense, so I'm going to spend a little more time on it. He says, and believe me, this is what it's like to read Shobogenzo. It's just an endless headache. We caution against committing wrongs. Don't commit wrong. We tell you that. Don't commit wrongs. We encourage you to practice the right things in life. We encourage you to do right. But all of this is in a broader context. It's not just the context of what you're thinking. It's not just the context of each action, but rather what ultimately matters is what you are in the reality of the world, in the reality of not committing wrong. He actually uses this phrase, not committing wrong, and he just says not committing, as a phrase to define reality. That you want to live a reality of not committing wrong, that this needs to become actualization for you. And again, if this is not making a lot of sense, part of Zen is thinking on things like this year after year. Zen is not a fast-moving thing. So, I'm trying to give it to you as best I can in my simple understanding. The doing of right, the doing of wrong are momentary occurrences in a broader perspective of a reality, of an actualization of the world in which you aren't committing wrong. That this is what your being is, your essence is, trying not to commit wrong moment by moment. So it's very deep. It's not just a list of do's and don'ts. It's about what are you? Brad Warner, the guy who likes to paraphrase Shobogenzo for those of us who have trouble with it, probably sums it up best in this paragraph. Doing the right thing is not the self, nor is it known by the self, nor is it someone else, or known by someone else. It is the act of knowing. There is self and other. In the act of seeing, there is self and other, the viewer, the observed. But doing the right thing is beyond such distinctions. It is just the right thing doing itself. In other words, don't become dualistic. Don't think about me and you. Doing the right thing is almost an entity in existence in and of itself. Dogen goes on to argue that in each action of the right thing being done, the entire universe is involved. No one ever said Dogen was easy to understand. Can you really imagine that when you pick up that newspaper and do the right thing, the entire universe is involved in that action? That's the teaching anyway. Make of it what you will. But back to our monk. Pick up the newspaper. because the entire universe is involved in that simple action. Perhaps one day, you will not think about outside observers. You will not think about your own ego and your own observation of yourself as you do it. It will become simply part of life to pick up the newspaper. Jesus tells us that as we live our lives, we need to worry about ourselves and our own flaws. That's that plank in the eye, the giant branch that we can't even see through, but we're worried about somebody else. He also lays down a threat. The standards you expect of others are the standards by which you will be judged. Now, this may refer to a final judgment in context, but it could just as easily refer to the way others are going to judge you and how they will act towards you right now, in the here and now. He points out that the fruit we bear shows the kind of tree that we are. A bad tree does not bear good fruit. A good tree bears good fruit. A good tree picks up the newspaper. But how do we define good? That's always a sticky wicket, isn't it? Even if you have all these laws allegedly handed down by God defining what sin is and what sin isn't, there's always an endless series of, well, what about this situation? There's a million permutations. Here's a simple way to look at it. When you are faced with a choice of options and things aren't crystal clear to you, I would suggest you do this. Ask yourself, do my actions or words cause harm, suffering, or loss to someone else? Am I attempting to justify this harm, suffering, or loss in some way, but in reality, I'm just looking for an easy way out, or I'm looking for personal gain? If you are, don't do it. It's just that simple. And really, if you're honest with yourself, most of the time you'll be able to figure it out too. It's not as hard as we like to make it out to be. And yes, it is also true that sometimes we do things with the best of intentions, pure desire to do good, and they don't turn out well. That's a given too. That's the complexity of life. That doesn't mean stop trying because something blew up in my face once. Just be very attuned to what's going on. Be aware of what's going on in the moment and give it your best shot. It is that simple. Just pick up the newspaper. That should have been the title of the sermon, Pick Up the Newspaper. Integrity is how you act when no one is looking, and you don't expect anyone to ever know what it is you did. Not even yourself. You do it simply because it's the right action at the time. Getting to the point in your life where this comes naturally is the work of the lifetime. In fact, in this same fascicle, there's a story of two monks, and one monk says to his master, what is the secret of Zen and Buddhism? What is the underlying teaching? And the master says, don't do wrong, do right. And the student says, well, that's ridiculous. A 5-year-old can say that. And he says, yes, but an 80-year-old can't live it. It is the work of a lifetime. Do not assume you've arrived. Each day, each moment is about doing right, not doing wrong. Hopefully you will find a particular path that's worth traveling that helps you as you wrestle with these decisions. And equally, hopefully, coming here and being with us and having these times together helps you in that path. And thank you for taking of your time and being here this Sunday morning.